So if you have any pain in maybe the front of your hip, maybe the low back, or maybe even the knee, well, the culprit might be this muscle here highlighted in yellow called the rectus femoris. And we're going to talk a little bit about one strategy that I like as a starting point for making that feel a little bit better and opening up some range of motion. Now, the rectus femoris originates, meaning that it starts from the anterior inferior iliac spine known as the ASIS in the superior part of the acetabulum. And all that means is that it just attaches to the front of the hip in the hip socket, if we just want to make that easy. And it inserts, meaning that it attaches farther away from your hip, down at this area where it is the tibial tuberosity and the patella, meaning just like the top of your shin bone and your kneecap, basically, right? And what it does is, because it crosses two joints, it's called a biarticular muscle, it'll cause hip flexion because it crosses the hip and it crosses the knee. It'll cause hip flexion, which means that we're trying to bring our knee up towards our hip, or I even like to think, like, if you were to pull your knee up towards your stomach, that's hip flexion. Or if you were to sit down in a squat and bring your stomach towards your knee, that's hip flexion, right? And it also causes knee extension. So just the straightening out of that knee. If you had your knee kind of curled towards your butt, then extending it out would be straightening that leg. And that's its other action there. So it has two things that it really does. And this is important because that means that in order to stretch that muscle out, if it's actively going to want to straighten the leg and lift the thigh up, that means that we need to bend the knee and also get the thigh behind the body a little bit to stretch that into a lengthened position. And that's really important to understand as to why we do that in this next movement here. So I'm right away going to position this one in a single leg variation, because when I'm biased towards one leg being a little more elevated off the ground, that's putting me in a little more passive hip extension. And then we're able to get a little more length in rect fem. We're trying to actively flex the knee by driving that heel towards that butt, right? But we're also trying to actively extend the hip, and hip extension just looks as like pushing your hips through a little bit without compensating through the lumbar spine and arching your back, right? So what we're going to try and do is squeeze the glutes just a little bit while we drive that heel towards the butt, and that's going to give us a ton of work through that rec fem as we start to open it up. We want to add in this active component as we do this kind of passive modality, and that's going to do really well at getting the nervous system to change tone a little bit and get those muscles to loosen up so you can then move through a little bit better range of motion at the hip and at the knee. Now, if that's way too challenging for you, a good starting point can just be, let's foam roll both quads together and let's just get a little bit of knee bend while we do it. Can we just bend those knees a little bit, and then can we start to bend them a little bit more over time? But other than that, this is going to be a great drill to be able to allow yourself to open up the front of that hip, the front of that quad, and to be able to better gain access to the positions that you need. Now that we've kind of turned down the tone, we've relaxed that rec fem a little bit, we're going to start to kind of pull it through some different ranges of motion and start to open up even a little bit more mobility through that kind of interior hip and even knee. Now, what you're going to see here is we're going to go through this kind of like clock, or even like around the world, however you want to word it, in terms of stretching out that back leg. So the left rec fem in this position, right? Now, an important consideration here is look at my back foot. My back foot is blocked off. It could be a doorway, it could be a box, or whatever you want. But all that does is it makes sure that we lock that back leg into place, that we're not going to have any shifting around of that knee or any real like turning of anything else there. So we make sure that we standardize the position and we force us to stretch that back leg at different angles and through different ranges of motion, as you're going to see as I go through this now, right? And it's really important that we not just go straight on, we kind of go out, we go across the body. And if you're looking at a clock, it's almost like we start at like, I don't know, maybe a 2 o'clock position and we go 1, 12, 11, and then to 10, and then back around the clock. And you can even try and get further into it if you want. But as we stretch this through the body and having that back foot that blocks it out, we're able to get different angles that we can stretch that muscle from, we can stretch that hip from, and be able to open up the ranges of motion that we need. And from there, you can just go back around the clock as you want. And this will be a great one to follow up with some type of release like we did with that foam roller. Now we've kind of turned down the tone, we've allowed that muscle to be willing to work through a range of motion, and now we kind of passively work it through a range of motion by doing these different angles that we stretch it through. And you'd hold each of these positions for a good 10 to 30 seconds before moving on to the next one. Now this next one, we're going to be using a front foot elevated split squat. And I really like this one for a couple of reasons. Is one, it shifts our center of mass back. So by elevating our front foot on a plate there, We then shift our center of mass. It's almost like we tilt ourselves back. We shift some weight onto that back leg there. And what that means is, because that back leg, if you look here right now, this angle of hip to knee, what we see there is we're in some relative hip extension behind the body there, right? And we are actively working through that as we load this back leg due to the fact that our center of mass is shifted back and we have more weight in that back leg. So by not allowing that knee to travel forward in the front, we keep weight even more in the back leg, and we cause us to have to drive those toes down in the back to use the back leg to get us up out of the bottom position. So now we're starting to load a more hip extended position, and it'll carry over into the next one we do. So this is a great drill to follow up with after we opened up some range of motion. We were able to get some hip extension, and now we train some active hip extension there. We got some passive, now we train some active, right? Now this final layer that we're gonna do is we're gonna work through this rear foot elevated, anterior loaded split squat position. I consider this to kind of be like the final boss of this series that we're doing. And let's look at why. So without even starting the video yet, what's going on here is we're getting an incredibly lengthened rec fem, right? We know that the rec fem crosses the hip and it crosses the knee. So what we need to do, like we've talked about, is we need to get that knee kind of behind the hip, which it is there. And we also need to get our heel towards our butt and close down that position to lengthen it both at the knee and at the hip, right? This position is going to do a really good job. We have that weight in the front of us that's going to keep us from putting our weight too far forward, given the rear foot elevated nature of this position. And it's also going to help us keep some type of good position in terms of rib cage over pelvis, right? That's going to allow us to stretch and get some length and stimulus of the rec fem even better. Now, here's where the execution happens. Now, watch as I go through this lift. It's almost like I'm sitting backwards, right? As we move backwards in space, and you see that my center of mass is closer. Before it was more over the top of this leg here, right? Now it's closer to being over the top of that back leg there, right? Meaning that that back leg has a ton of load in this lengthened rec fem position. And then what I'm thinking of as I come up is I'm not going to be trying to press through this foot as much. It'll help a little bit, obviously, but I'm trying to drive that back heel against that pad like I'm performing a leg extension. A leg extension is a great exercise for a shortened rec fem, but this is going to be the exercise for a lengthened rec fem, because we're getting that big range of motion at the knee in terms of eccentrically loading that rec fem into that knee flex position, but we're also getting that lengthened position across the hip as we have that knee position behind the hip there. And then we perform that leg extension against the pad there, and it's going to be a perfect recipe for lengthened rec fem stimulus. And the idea behind this one is not only do we make that rec fem bigger and stronger, right? But we start to reinforce that position that we're working on. We start to open up some range of motion and allow it to get access to these kind of eccentric lengthened positions, which is going to be huge, whether it's in life or you're an athlete and it's in sport. We have to be able to extend the hip. And when we can't extend the hip, we have issues up and downstream. So by doing this, you'll be able to take care of issues at both the low back, the knee, and the hip itself. Make sure, I think that some type of lengthened rec fem training should be a non-negotiable at some point over the training evolution of an individual. So make sure you implement this one, and hopefully it helps you out a little bit with your training.